adapted this Egyptian judgment scene from 125 of the Book of the Dead, it appears to be an inept amalgam of Hebrew and Greek, showing that only an ignorant knave like Joseph Smith Fellow could have coined it, and the actual Egyptian figure is represented by the god Horus. They could say figure number 5 does not represent the biblical Enoch, but rather the Egyptian god Thoth. And figure 6 is not the angel of the Lord, but it is the Egyptian goddess of Mot. In every instance, the figures in this Testament of Abraham are adaptations of the ancient Egyptian themes in a Semitic context. The modern Egyptologist translating this would properly say, no, the figures are wrong. And in that respect, they would be correct. But the adaptation of the judgment scene 125 in the Testament of Abraham is not meant to reflect an Egyptian meaning whatsoever. It's meant for a Semitic audience. And it has two contexts, the Egyptian and the Semitic. The same principle is involved with our Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith Papyri with which it came from. These facsimiles are genuine Egyptian documents, but the illustrations are to a Semitic understanding concerning Abraham. From our perspective, it's Egyptologically wrong, this Testament of Abraham. But it's not our perspective that counts. The question is, what did it mean to the ancient Semites who wrote that Testament of Abraham and adapted a Jewish context to its meaning with Abraham? You're right. It's not the god Horus. You're right. It is the god Horus. You're right. It's not Enoch. You're right, it's not Abraham, and so on and so forth. It's Egyptian figures in the original context. But that's irrelevant to the Semitic adaptation of that Egyptian document to their own story. Or the Osiris-Abraham example is even more startling here. Another example of an Egyptian material being refracted through a Semitic lens is actually the story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. It's about the rich man in Abraham's bosom, Lazarus in Abraham's bosom, and the rich man being tortured and punished because he wasn't careful with his resources while he was here on earth. In the important study on this, Hugo Gressman says the Luke's account, now this is in our New Testament, Luke's account was based on a popular Jewish version, perhaps written in Hebrew, of an Egyptian story. Neither the Egyptian original nor the Jewish version of that original has survived. Nevertheless, their existence can be inferred from other documents that we do have anyway. The popular Jewish version can also be deduced from 7 late rabbinic splinters of this story. These texts almost certainly do not derive directly from the Gospel of Luke. The Egyptian original of this story of Abraham's bosom in Luke chapter 16 is hypothesized based on the Egyptian demotic story of Setna. To analogize the relationship among these texts in genealogical terms, the Egyptian original is like a grandfather. The popular Jewish version is a father to the account in Luke. The story of Setna is a kind of uncle to the Lucan account, and the 7 rabbinical splinters are nieces and nephews of sort, as a basic analogy to show the relationships. The demotic story of Setna is known from a single papyrus manuscript in the British Museum. It was written on the back of 2 Greek business documents, one of which was dated to the 7th year of Claudius, his reign, AD 46 to 47. What we essentially have in the story of Luke, in Luke chapter 16, is an Egyptian story that has been transformed into Semitic dress. The angels of the Lucan account appear to be an instrumentality substituted for Horus in the Egyptian original. The bosom of Abraham represents the Egyptian concept Amte, the Egyptian abode of the dead. And most remarkably, Abraham in Luke chapter 16 is a Jewish substitute for the pagan Egyptian god Osiris. Just as is the case in facsimiles number 1 and facsimiles number 3, Abraham is replacing Osiris in those Egyptian facsimiles in our book of Abraham. These relationships are utterly intriguing because we have absolute historical evidence now that Jews adapted Egyptian documents. They changed the figures from the original Egyptian context into Semitic figures and then adapted them to Abraham. That is precisely what we have in our book of Abraham with the facsimiles and their explanations. They may not meet the modern-day Egyptian and Egyptological standards. But so what? They were adapted by a Jewish person who transmitted the text and brought in Egyptian materials and changed from the original Egyptian context to tie in with his understanding of the situation Abraham was in this particular book of Abraham, which ended up in Joseph Smith's hands. Also interesting is the Egyptian hypocephalus, the round picture in the book of Abraham, facsimile number 2. A kind of a companion text to the Testament of Abraham is the Apocalypse of Abraham. And like the Testament, the Apocalypse also dates to the 1st or 2nd century A.D. It tells the story of how Abraham in his youth perceived that the idols were simply creations of men and they weren't really gods at all. And after leaving his father's house, Abraham is commanded to offer a sacrifice so that God will reveal great things to him. God sends him his angel, Yaoel. It's a form of Jehovah. And what Yaoel does is he takes Abraham on a tour to heaven, and there he sees several visions. In his tour, the text is only extant in the number of old Slavonic medieval manuscripts. But they've deduced, with the presence of the Hebrew names and the words and phrases, as well as other Hebraisms, such as the use of the positive for the comparative in the document itself, that this text was originally composed in Hebrew, in which event the probable provenance, of course, is Palestine for the text itself, its original. Michael Rhodes describes what appears to be a possible allusions to a hypocephalus in the Apocalypse of Abraham. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, we have a remarkable fact that Abraham has a vision where he sees the fullness of the whole earth and its circle. This appears to be a description of a hypocephalus. This vision includes the plan of the universe, what is in the heavens, on the earth, in the sea, in the abyss. These are very close to the words used in the very middle portion of the Joseph Smith hypocephalus itself. Now, the Apocalypse of Abraham also indicates that a description of 4 fiery beings and creatures, each with 4 faces, were understood to have existed: a lion, a man, an ox, and an eagle. This is most certainly a Semitic transformation of the sons of Horus. Of course, you think immediately of Ezekiel chapters 1 and 2 as well. These are represented as figure 6 of facsimile number 2. These relationships are similar to the Egyptian materials, but they are adapted to a Jewish Semitic